In a dramatic sequence of coordinated sorties, defenders emerged from tunnels and posterns to strike supply lines, set siege engines ablaze, and harry flanks. Panic spread through the attackers' ranks. They realized that every gain would be temporary and costly. Every attempt could result in devastating counterstrikes. The morale that had carried them this far now faltered, and their formations began to collapse under the pressure of Troy's combined arms of strategy, metallurgy, and social coordination. The siege ended not in a single dramatic breach, but through attrition, psychological warfare, and the unyielding integration of technological innovation with human organization. Troy survived because it had mastered not just bronze, but the social and logistical systems necessary to wield it effectively. Bronze axes and spearheads had provided the physical means, but the city's resilience relied equally on coordination, foresight, and the shared commitment of its inhabitants. The defenders' victory was a testament to the cumulative knowledge of generations, the metallurgical expertise of craftsmen, the tactical acumen of military leaders, the administrative coordination of families and temple authorities, and the adaptability of a population that had learned to survive in a complex, interconnected world. After the siege, life within Troy gradually returned to its rhythm, but the lessons endured. Bronze workshops continued to produce tools and weapons, trade networks resumed, and urban planning integrated the lessons of the siege with improved fortifications, more efficient logistics, and refined production techniques. The city had not only survived, but emerged stronger. Its social hierarchies reinforced, its technological knowledge expanded, and its cultural identity solidified. Bronze objects that once served primarily as tools of utility or status now carried symbolic weight. They represented resilience, ingenuity, and the intertwined fates of craft, strategy, and community that in the broader narrative of human history. Troy's triumph illustrates the profound interplay between technology, society, and survival. The city's mastery of bronze metallurgy, urban organization, and strategic foresight exemplifies how early civilizations harnessed materials, skills, and social systems to overcome existential threats. Troy's story serves as a bridge between the earliest experiments in metalworking and the emergence of complex urban societies, demonstrating that technological innovation alone is not enough. It is the integration of knowledge, craft, and social cohesion that transforms resources into resilience and ingenuity into survival. By the end of this era, Troy had become more than a fortified city. It was a testament to human creativity, adaptation, and the enduring power of knowledge passed across generations. Its legacy would echo through the Bronze Age and beyond, influencing trade, warfare, and urban development across Anatolia, the Mediterranean, and even distant regions. The siege, the strategies, and the mastery of bronze formed a narrative of triumph and endurance, showing how communities that embraced both innovation and unity could endure challenges that would have destroyed less organized societies. The story of Troy, forged in bronze and sustained by human ingenuity, closes this chapter of ancient history with a vivid demonstration of how technology, social organization, and determination combine to define the survival and legacy of civilizations, leaving a blueprint for generations to come. This concludes the saga. Inside, daily life and survival blended seamlessly with defense. Children delivered messages. Apprentices assisted with bellows and mold handling. Women reinforced barricades and managed supplies, and elders provided tactical insight drawn from generations of experience. Bronze, once a symbol of wealth and craft, had become a lifeline. Every sword forged, every arrowhead shaped, every shield reinforced directly influenced who would live and who would fall as the siege dragged on. Tension inside Troy reached a boiling point, and the city's leaders realized that passive defense alone would not secure victory. Coordinated sorties were planned, small, swift, and precise attacks designed to harass the besiegers, disrupt their camps, and seize critical supplies. Bronze weapons became the centerpiece of these operations. Spears, axes, and even hastily reforged tools were wielded with lethal precision. and armor glinted in the sun as groups of warriors darted out from hidden gates and alleys. Each strike was calculated. Hit hard, retreat before reinforcements could respond, and repeat until enemy morale fractured. The attackers, though numerous and well-equipped, were not prepared for Troy's combination of ingenuity, social cohesion, and technological superiority. Bronze swords held edges far longer than expected, shattering the rhythm of assault waves. Counterattacks from the rooftops rained arrows tipped with bronze, striking at critical siege engineers and causing chaos in the ranks. Even small innovations, bronze-studded gates, reinforced ladders, and traps cleverly hidden along likely approaches, slowed the enemy's advance, forcing them to expend precious energy and supplies with little gain. Within the city, the coordination of these sorties showcased a remarkable fusion of strategy and community organization. Families specialized in metalworking produced weapons continuously, while runners and messengers ensured that each squad received exactly what they needed at the precise moment. Observation points on towers allowed commanders to track enemy movement and redirect units instantly. Bronze hammers and molds were as crucial as bronze-tipped spears, each element contributing to a living, breathing war machine that Troy's defenders also leveraged terrain cleverly. Narrow streets and alleyways acted as choke points, funneled enemy forces into zones where bronze arrows, rolling stones, and heavy gates could inflict maximum damage. Elevated platforms allowed defenders to strike from above, while hidden passages enabled small teams to launch surprise attacks and vanish before retaliation. Every inch of the city became a tool in the hands of strategists who understood both human psychology and the physical properties of bronze. Meanwhile, morale inside the city was maintained through ritual and symbolism. Bronze bells, figurines, and ornamental objects were displayed prominently, reminding the citizens of Troy's heritage and the significance of their struggle. Music and chanting coordinated with the sounds of workshops, creating a rhythm that kept both laborers and warriors synchronized in their efforts. Even as hunger and exhaustion crept in, the sight of freshly forged bronze weapons and the gleam of polished shields fueled determination. Outside, the attackers began to falter. They were trained to expect simple fortifications and predictable resistance, not a city where every artisan, every child, and every elder played a role in defense. Bronze became the great equalizer. Heavier shields absorbed blows, reinforced gates held against battering rams, and weapons maintained their effectiveness over extended combat, outlasting stone alternatives. Frustration grew among enemy commanders as each attempt to breach Troy was met with adaptable defenses and devastating counterattacks. The turning point came when Troy's defenders executed a daring night sortie. Small bands of warriors slipped silently through prearranged tunnels and hidden posterns, striking supply depots and setting ablaze enemy siege engines. Bronze weapons, resistant to the heat of fire and durable under repeated strikes, allowed the attackers to be neutralized without loss of momentum. Panic spread through the besiegers' camp as the realization dawned. Troy was not a city to be taken by brute force alone. Every attempt to assault its walls now carried the risk of devastating counterattacks. The psychological impact of these maneuvers cannot be overstated. Attackers, previously confident in their numbers and siege equipment, now faced uncertainty at every turn. The sight of bronze swords flashing from unexpected angles, the precision of reinforcements emerging from hidden streets, and the relentless rhythm of the city's coordinated defenses slowly eroded their morale. Troy's mastery of metallurgy, urban planning, and social cohesion transformed the siege from a test of brute strength into a strategic battle of wits, patience, and endurance. As the siege of Troy drew to its climax, the city's combination of ingenuity, metallurgy, and social cohesion reached its fullest expression. The attackers, demoralized and depleted, had begun to falter under the relentless pressure of the defenders' coordinated strategies. Troy's walls, reinforced with bronze-studded gates, layered barricades, and adaptive fortifications, had withstood repeated battering, and the sorties that struck at enemy camps had severed supply lines and shattered morale. Every arrow, spear, and axe, carefully forged and maintained by the city's master craftsmen, had played its role. Bronze, once simply a material of utility and status, had become the lifeblood of Troy's defense, the invisible hand guiding every movement, every strategy, every calculated risk. Inside the city, the population had evolved into a finely tuned organism. Workshops never ceased their work, day and night, producing not only weapons but also tools, household goods, and symbolic artifacts that reinforce morale and identity. Families coordinated logistics with precision. Water, food, and raw materials flowed efficiently through hidden channels, while bronzesmiths, carpenters, and strategists communicated constantly, responding to every threat with improvisation informed by knowledge accumulated over generations. The city's young warriors, trained in both combat and metallurgy, understood that their survival depended not only on courage, but also on technical skill and precision. Every polished bronze blade and every carefully cast spearhead mattered as much as the planning behind its deployment. Trade networks, which had once been the source of Troy's wealth, became crucial instruments of survival. Alliances with neighboring settlements ensured the arrival of additional copper, tin, and other essential materials, while the city's strategic location controlling the Dardanelles Strait allowed for limited but vital maritime resupply. Ships navigated the narrow channel, guided by signal fires and landmarks established for centuries, delivering metals, grain, and other necessities while avoiding hostile forces. Troy's ability to maintain these lifelines during the siege was a testament to the sophistication of its logistics and the foresight of its leaders, blending commerce, geography, and metallurgical expertise into a single defensive strategy in the city itself. Morale was maintained through ritual, symbol, and shared purpose. Bronze bells, once mere instruments of ceremony, now rang as signals of readiness, coordination, and warning. Public displays of bronze objects, axes, vessels, and ornaments serve as reminders of Troy's enduring legacy and the stakes of survival. Music, storytelling, and communal labor created rhythm and cohesion, turning fear and exhaustion into collective determination. The entire population, from children delivering messages to elders advising on tactics, was integrated into a single social and military organism. In this way, Troy transformed the chaos of siege into a demonstration of human ingenuity, collaboration, and technological mastery. The decisive moments came when the attackers, overextended and disorganized, attempted a massive frontal assault, relying on sheer numbers and siege engines. Troy's defenders responded with the culmination of centuries of metallurgical innovation and strategic planning. Bronze-tipped arrows and spears pierced the advancing forces, reinforced gates withstood the battering rams, and hidden counterattacks struck at key commanders and siege engineers. Trade and supply chains, though strained, remained essential. Messengers carried coded instructions to allies and suppliers beyond the city, requesting tin and copper from distant Anatolian mines, while local workshops recycled and reforged damaged bronze to ensure no material went to waste. Even under siege, Troy's economic system relied on careful coordination. Families with metallurgical expertise became indispensable, their control over resources giving them influence that rivaled military leaders. Bronze was no longer just a tool. It was currency, status, and survival all in one. Cultural life persisted despite the chaos. Temples and shrines, though partially fortified, continued to serve as centers of ritual, gathering people for ceremonies that reinforced social cohesion and psychological resilience. Bronze vessels, ceremonial weapons, and ornamental pins were displayed, connecting inhabitants to their heritage and reminding them of the city's prestige. Artisans created new pieces even as arrows and spears flew outside, working in small, protected niches to maintain both functionality and beauty. Music, storytelling, and communal meals helped sustain morale, blending the ordinary with the extraordinary in a city under pressure. Soldiers inside the walls faced constant challenges. Bronze armor weighed heavily, Yet its protection allowed them to withstand repeated assaults. They practiced rapid formations, signaling with horns and flags to coordinate movement across rooftops, battlements, and internal streets. Archers on towers were constantly recalibrating their positions, adjusting for wind, distance, and enemy maneuvers. Chariot teams stood ready in hidden courtyards, their bronze fittings maintained and polished, prepared for sudden sorties. The combination of martial skill, metallurgical knowledge, and social coordination created a dynamic, living defense network. Troy itself became an instrument of strategy. The psychological tension was omnipresent. The threat of breach, the loss of a gatehouse, or the sound of collapsing walls tested endurance. Every household balanced personal survival with civic responsibility. Families with access to skilled metalworkers, storehouses, or secret passages gained leverage, while those without connections relied on communal support, bargaining their labor and knowledge in exchange for protection and food. Social hierarchies adapted in real time, showing that even in siege, Troy's sophisticated systems of authority, craftsmanship, and trade continued to operate. AS days turned into weeks. Ingenuity and resourcefulness defined survival. Bronze workshops became mobile, moving to safer courtyards when walls were threatened. Salvaged bronze was melted down and recast into new tools and weapons. Artisans developed faster annealing methods, experimented with alloy compositions, and reinforced key defensive implements. Families took turns guarding the forges, ensuring no disruption in production. Every bellows puff, hammer strike, and careful quench represented more than craft. It was the pulse of the city itself, a heartbeat of resilience in bronze. Even at night, the city never truly rested. Watchfires dotted rooftops, archers rotated shifts, and messengers carried intelligence through shadowed lanes. The smell of smelting bronze mixed with hearth smoke, creating a sensory constant that reminded everyone of both the danger outside and the endurance within. Children, now familiar with the rhythm of siege, learned to move silently, carrying messages, or watching blacksmiths shape molten metal, absorbing lessons that would define the next generation of Troy's artisans and warriors. The siege of Troy intensified as attackers tested every wall, every gate, and every hidden approach. While inside, the city responded with a combination of ingenuity, resilience, and the very metal that had elevated its status. Chariot units thundered across the open plains surrounding Troy, bronze fittings glinting in the sunlight, their wheels carving deep ruts into the hardened soil. Archers atop walls and towers rained arrows down, many tipped with bronze points that could pierce leather, wood, and even lightly armored infantry. The clash was deafening, metal striking metal, the grinding of wheels on stone, shouts, and the occasional scream piercing the air. Inside the city, bronze smiths worked feverishly, reforging broken weapons and creating new ones from salvaged metal. Hammers struck rhythmically against anvils. Molten bronze poured into molds, and bellows roared to life, sending plumes of heat and smoke into the night sky. Families coordinated delivery of raw ore, fuel, and tools, understanding that each axe, spear, or shield directly influenced the outcome of the battle. Strategists mapped every possible approach the enemy could take, marking streets for rapid reinforcement, positioning hidden caches of weapons along the most likely breach points, and fortifying weak segments of walls with bronze reinforcements. Tactical chariot strikes became a deadly chess game. Raiders approached from multiple directions, using speed and maneuverability to exploit any opening, only to be met with carefully timed counterattacks. Defenders had developed pulley systems to drop heavy bronze-studded gates or rocks from walls, disrupting enemy formations. Archers synchronized their volleys to create kill zones, while soldiers reinforced barricades under constant threat. Bronze swords and spears, forged with meticulous precision, proved superior in repeated clashes, holding edges longer and maintaining structural integrity where stone or iron would fail. Even civilian structures became part of the defense. Workshops were converted into barricades, storerooms into armories, and rooftops became platforms for observation and missile deployment. Signals flashed from tower to tower, directing reinforcements across the winding streets and rooftops. Bronze bells, gongs, and horn signals created a network of communication that allowed Troy to react almost instantaneously to enemy movements. The city itself became a living, breathing defensive organism, where metallurgy, urban planning, and strategy fused into one continuous action. Days bled into nights. Resource management became critical. Food supplies were rationed meticulously, water drawn from hidden wells, and bronze carefully recycled to maintain weapon production. The city's social structure adapted in real time. Skilled metalworkers, experienced warriors, and trusted administrators gained elevated authority, coordinating everything from production schedules to patrol rotations. Families with specialized knowledge, particularly those able to supervise furnaces or mold production, were granted access to strategic positions, turning craft into influence and influence into survival. The psychological toll was immense. Citizens moved constantly, aware that every misstep could cost lives. Yet, alongside fear, a fierce sense of identity and unity bound the inhabitants. Ceremonial bronze objects, from small figurines to decorated vessels, were displayed in public spaces, symbolizing Troy's endurance and legacy. Music, storytelling, and ritual helped to maintain morale, while bronze bells and chimes from workshops echoed across rooftops, creating a rhythm that reinforced the community's cohesion. Strategists inside Troy also exploited topography. Narrow streets funneled attackers into concentrated areas where bronze-tipped projectiles, hidden pits, and reinforced barricades could maximize damage. Elevated platforms allowed for multi-layered defense, while rooftop bridges enabled rapid redeployment of troops. Even minor innovations in bronze metallurgy, sharper spear tips, stronger alloyed gates, and reinforced hinges, had immediate tactical implications, demonstrating how technological sophistication intertwined with military strategy. The attackers, realizing that the city's internal organization and bronze resources gave Troy a formidable advantage, escalated their efforts. Siege engines, battering rams, and scaled ladders were deployed in synchronized waves, but every attempt was met with adaptive defenses. Bronze-clad walls absorbed impacts, counterweights, and pulleys allowed defenders to hurl massive stones, and skilled marksmen targeted key operators to disrupt coordination. Each failure forced the attackers to rethink tactics, but the defenders' use of metallurgy, communication, and social cohesion kept Troy standing against overwhelming pressure. The convergence of trade, metallurgy, urban planning, and military organization set the stage for one of the most iconic conflicts of the ancient world. The walls of Troy would not only resist invaders, but also symbolize the stakes of power, wealth, and prestige in the Bronze Age. Heroes would rise, alliances would shift, and the interplay of human ambition, technology, and strategy would leave a legacy recorded both in myth and in the archaeological record. This next chapter of history blends metallurgy, urban sophistication, and warfare into a narrative that reveals how Bronze Age civilizations were far more interconnected and complex than previously imagined. The rise and fall of these fortified cities, the development of chariot warfare, and the management of vast trade networks were all part of a dynamic system where survival and glory were inseparable. The story now moves closer to the legendary battlefield, where the clash of armies, the ingenuity of chariot tactics, and the courage of individual warriors would echo across the centuries, inspiring the epics that would survive long after the cities themselves had fallen into ruin. The sun rose over the fortified city, casting long shadows across the limestone walls, glinting off bronze helmets and polished shields as thousands of soldiers readied themselves. Inside Troy, the city hummed with tension. Civilians moved cautiously, carrying supplies to the gatehouses and secret storerooms, while blacksmiths in interior workshops hammered swords, repaired armor, and reinforced chariot axles. Outside the walls, the besieging army had gathered on the plains, a patchwork of infantry, archers, and chariots, the metallic sheen of weapons reflecting the early morning light like a warning flare. The clash of Bronze Age warfare was as much a test of strategy as strength. Commanders surveyed the terrain, calculating how to exploit weak points in fortifications, how to coordinate chariot charges with missile volleys, and how to prevent friendly units from colliding in the chaos of battle. Every decision had consequences. A misstep could turn a well-trained regiment into chaos. The soldiers understood that their bronze swords were not just weapons, but investments in human skill and metal knowledge. Crafted with precision, designed to last, and carefully maintained to survive the rigors of combat. Chariots, relatively light but heavily reinforced, became the backbone of offensive maneuvers. Teams of 2 to 4 horses pulled each platform, with one warrior wielding a spear or bow while another steered. The speed allowed rapid strikes along the city's outer walls, while the thundering of hooves created psychological pressure on defenders. Troop formations shifted in fluid patterns, as commanders balanced the need to press forward with the risk of overextending their lines. Inside Troy, defenders relied not only on walls but on ingenuity. Archers were stationed on elevated platforms, raining arrows upon approaching soldiers. Engineers constructed temporary barricades and trap mechanisms near the gates, forcing attackers to slow their advance and creating kill zones. Bronze-tipped spears, sharpened obsidian blades, and reinforced shields were distributed among the citizen soldiers, many of whom had trained in both craft and combat from adolescence. These warriors understood that victory depended as much on coordination and discipline as on sheer numbers or ferocity. As the battle began, the air filled with the sounds of clashing metal, the screams of warriors, and the thundering of hoofs. Chariots charged, skidding to sudden stops to pivot and thrust their riders into enemy ranks. Bronze spears met bronze shields, sending echoes through the battlefield, while archers peppered troops from distance. Smoke from torches and early incendiary devices drifted along the plains, adding confusion and fear, masking movements, and creating opportunities for surprise attacks. Commanders adapted quickly. Reinforcements were shifted from one flank to another, signals relayed using horns and flags to coordinate movements over hundreds of meters of terrain. Every piece of knowledge, from metallurgy to terrain awareness to horse handling, was being applied in real time. The stakes were life and death, and the soldiers' understanding of bronze as both tool and weapon turned the tide repeatedly in skirmishes along the city's perimeter. Beyond the immediate conflict, the battle was also a reflection of human ambition, resource control, and social power. Families who controlled bronze workshops and access to copper and tin were responsible for supplying weapons, forging alliances, and sustaining morale. Victory meant more than conquest. It meant dominance in trade, control of wealth, and the continuation of dynastic authority. The intertwining of metal, strategy, and society created a battlefield that was as much about politics and economics as it was about physical combat. As the day wore on, the siege evolved into a complex dance of attack and counterattack. Siege towers rolled forward under protective screens, while defenders hurled stones and molten mixtures from above. Chariot charges broke lines only to be met by disciplined spear formations. Archers on both sides tried to find openings, and skirmishers darted between barricades, exploiting every advantage. The city's layout, its internal streets, hidden alleys, and fortified gates were all used strategically, turning Troy itself into a weapon as much as the armies surrounding it. The psychological intensity matched the physical. Both sides had seen the cost of failure, death, destruction, and the loss of social standing or territory. Bronze Age warriors, unlike their Stone Age predecessors, had invested in equipment that could be repaired, reforged, and reused, yet each strike risked bending, cracking, or breaking the precious metal. Every moment demanded not only courage but expertise, a blend of craftsmanship, military discipline, and endurance that defined these early civilizations. As night approached, the battlefield transformed. Fires dotted the landscape, both from deliberate scorches and accidental conflagrations. The clash of armies slowed, replaced by tense quiet, patrols, and watchfires. Both sides assessed losses, repaired equipment, and planned the next day's maneuvers. The siege was far from over, and the outcome uncertain. Yet even in the lull, the stakes of this conflict were clear. Control over Troy meant access to trade, wealth, and influence in a world where bronze, strategy, and urban sophistication determined survival. Inside Troy, life continued in a tense rhythm, every heartbeat echoing with the distant clatter of bronze on bronze from the battlefield beyond the walls. Civilians moved carefully through narrow alleyways, hauling water, grain, and firewood, each step measured to avoid drawing enemy attention. Children, though shielded from direct combat, learned early that every action could influence survival, delivering messages between households, carrying small tools, or helping prepare food in shared kitchens. Women and men worked side by side, their labor essential to maintaining both morale and practical life under siege. In the workshops, bronze continued to shape society even under extreme stress. Blacksmiths hammered and reheated ingots, forging spearheads, knives, and arrow points, carefully monitoring temperature and alloy composition. They worked with an almost ritual precision, knowing that a single mistake could render a weapon useless or even dangerous. Apprentices observed closely, learning the secrets of metal flow, cooling rates, and annealing techniques that have been refined over generations. These craftsmen were not just creating tools. They were sustaining the very social and military fabric of the city. Meanwhile, the city's planners and strategists moved silently through courtyards and rooftops, directing soldiers, organizing watch shifts, and inspecting barricades. Each tower, gate, and wall segment was inspected multiple times a day. Bronze reinforcements on gates gleamed in the sunlight, a visible reminder that metal was power, an instrument of defense, authority, and status. Residents stored surplus weapons in hidden caches, redistributing them as needed, while scouts monitored the enemy camp beyond the walls, counting chariots, observing rotation patterns, and anticipating maneuvers. Many historians believe it was used for ritual purification ceremonies, suggesting that water held deep spiritual significance in Indus society. Another major urban center was Harappa, which gave the civilization its early name, the Harappan civilization. Like Mohenjo-daro, Harappa contained carefully organized streets, drainage systems, and massive storage facilities. Archaeologists discovered large brick platforms believed to have supported granaries, where grain from surrounding farms was stored before distribution. These cities were not chaotic collections of houses growing randomly over time. They were carefully designed urban environments, standardized brick sizes, uniform street layouts, and consistent architectural styles appear across hundreds of settlements. This suggests some form of regional planning or shared cultural standards across the entire civilization. But the Indus people left behind something even more mysterious. Throughout their cities, archaeologists have discovered thousands of small carved objects known as Indus seals. These seals are usually made from stone and engraved with intricate images. Animals such as bulls, elephants, rhinoceroses, and mythical creatures. Above the animals appear short lines of symbols forming the Indus script. Despite decades of research, this script remains undeciphered. Unlike Egyptian hieroglyphs or Mesopotamian cuneiform, no long texts have been found. Most inscriptions are extremely short, making it difficult for linguists to determine how the writing system worked. This means that much of Indus civilization remains a mystery. We do not know the names of their kings, we do not know the details of their religion, we do not know the stories they told. Yet their cities show evidence of remarkable social organization. Unlike Mesopotamia or Egypt, archaeologists have found very little evidence of massive royal palaces or grand temples in Indus cities. There are also few signs of large-scale warfare. Weapons are rare compared with other Bronze Age civilizations. This has led some historians to suggest that Indus society may have been governed differently, possibly through merchant elites, councils, or decentralized leadership rather than powerful warrior kings. Trade clearly played a huge role in their economy. Indus merchants traded across enormous distances, Archaeologists have discovered Indus seals and artifacts in Mesopotamian cities, such as Ur and Uruk. Mesopotamian records even refer to a distant land called Meluha, which most scholars believe refers to the Indus civilization. Ships from Meluha likely sailed across the Arabian Sea, bringing goods such as carnelian gemstones, ivory, exotic woods, cotton, textiles, copper, and other metals. In return, they received silver, tin, wool, textiles, and other goods from Mesopotamian markets. These maritime trade routes connected the Indus world with a larger Bronze Age economic system that stretched from the Mediterranean to South Asia. But despite its success, the Indus civilization would eventually face a mysterious decline. Around 1900 BC, many of its great cities were gradually abandoned. Trade networks weakened. Urban populations shrank. People moved towards smaller villages and rural settlements. Unlike the dramatic invasions that destroyed some other ancient civilizations, the decline of the Indus world appears to have happened slowly. Some researchers believe changes in river patterns may have played a role. The shifting of river channels could have disrupted agriculture and water supplies for major cities. Climate changes may also have reduced rainfall across the region, making large urban populations harder to sustain. Whatever the cause, one of the most advanced civilizations of the Bronze Age faded away, leaving behind its silent cities, undeciphered script, and unanswered questions. But while the Indus civilization declined, other parts of the Bronze Age world were moving toward a new era of power and conflict. Across the Mediterranean, powerful kingdoms were rising. Armies armed with bronze swords and chariots were preparing for wars that would echo through legend. And among the cities involved in those struggles was one perched beside a narrow strait between two seas, that a wealthy trading city, that a city protected by massive walls, that a city that would eventually become the center of one of the most famous wars in mythology, Troy. After the decline of the Indus cities, the Bronze Age world continued its relentless march forward, and in Anatolia, a powerful network of city-states and fortified settlements began to assert themselves. The strategic position of cities like Troy made them vital hubs for trade, connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea and controlling the flow of valuable metals, timber, and luxury goods that be by the middle of the second millennium BC. These cities were no longer just trade centers. They were fortified bastions of military might. Walls rose several meters high, constructed from massive limestone blocks, meticulously fitted together, reflecting an understanding of both engineering and strategic defense. Towers punctuated the walls, providing vantage points for archers and guards. Narrow gates were heavily reinforced to withstand battering rams, and a network of internal streets ensured that troops could move quickly to respond to any breach. The armies of this period were equipped in ways that show the early sophistication of Bronze Age warfare. Infantry carried bronze swords and spears, sometimes reinforced with wooden cores, while shields were large and often curved to deflect attacks. Chariots, a relatively new innovation, transformed mobility and tactics on a battlefield. Drawn by teams of horses, these wheeled platforms allowed commanders to strike with speed, deliver volleys of arrows, and retreat before enemy forces could respond. Trade and wealth fueled not just defense, but also competition. Metal resources, copper, tin, and the occasional gold, were limited, and control over these materials meant control over power. This created an environment where diplomacy was always underpinned by the threat of violence, and alliances could be formed or broken depending on access to crucial resources. It is in this context that the seeds of the legendary Trojan War were planted. While the exact historical reality behind the myth is debated, archaeologists have found clear evidence of destruction layers at the site of Troy, dating to the late Bronze Age. Burned structures, collapsed walls, and weapon fragments suggest that the city endured a period of violent conflict that could have inspired the epic tales of later Greek poets. The warriors who defended these cities were trained from youth, learning not only how to wield swords and shields, but also how to operate chariots, coordinate in units, and respond to the chaos of battle. Craftsmanship in bronze was not limited to tools and ornaments. Armor, helmets, and weaponry required precision to balance durability with mobility. Workshops within city walls produced weapons in significant quantities, indicating a systematic and organized approach to arming armies. Meanwhile, the civilian population had to adapt to the constant presence of military activity. Homes and workshops were often built behind protective walls, but even within these safe spaces, daily life was intertwined with preparation for conflict. Children would grow up seeing the forging of bronze, the sharpening of weapons, and the drilling of soldiers, all under the watchful eyes of elders who understood that survival depended as much on skill and strategy as on wealth and diplomacy. In addition to the immediate threat of warfare, these cities were connected through complex trade networks. Materials for bronze, copper from Anatolia, tin from distant regions, and gold from river valleys moved across hundreds of kilometers. Merchants were not just traders. They were vital lifelines, negotiating safe passage for convoys while often acting as informants about rival states. Knowledge of geography, seasonal winds, and the behavior of river currents became strategic assets, just as important as bronze swords on the battlefield. Religious and ceremonial life was closely tied to both warfare and resource management. Temples and shrines within these fortified cities often contained evidence of votive offerings, sacrificial rituals, and symbolic depictions of warriors or divine protectors. The spiritual authority of these institutions reinforced social hierarchy, legitimizing the power of kings and military leaders while also providing a framework for communal identity in times of both peace and war. And along its banks, one of the most stable and powerful civilizations of the ancient world began to emerge. Unlike Mesopotamia, where many competing city-states fought over irrigation canals and farmland, the geography of Egypt naturally encouraged unity. The Nile flowed in a long, predictable line from south to north, connecting communities rather than separating them. Its annual flooding was remarkably consistent, making agriculture reliable and productive. Because of this stability, Egyptian society developed differently from the constantly shifting political landscape of Mesopotamia. Around 3100 BC, the lands of Upper and Lower Egypt were unified under a single ruler known today as Narmer. This event marked the beginning of the Egyptian dynastic tradition, where kings, known as pharaohs, ruled the land as both political leaders and divine figures. The Egyptians, the pharaoh was not merely a king, he was considered the living representative of the gods on earth. His responsibility was to maintain Ma'at, the sacred balance of order, justice, and harmony that kept the universe functioning properly. If the pharaoh ruled well, the Nile would flood correctly, crops would grow, and the kingdom would prosper. If he failed, chaos might follow. Because of this belief, Egyptian kings invested enormous effort into securing their place in the afterlife. And that belief would lead to some of the most astonishing construction projects in human history. During the period known as the Old Kingdom of Egypt, Egyptian rulers began building monumental stone tombs designed to preserve their bodies and souls forever. The earliest of these structures were known as mastabas, rectangular stone or mud brick tombs with flat roofs and sloping sides. Beneath the structure, deep chambers held the burial of the ruler along with treasures, tools, and food intended for the afterlife. But one pharaoh had a far more ambitious idea. Around 2630 BC, the ruler Djoser commissioned a revolutionary new tomb at Saqqara. Instead of a single mastaba, his architect stacked multiple layers of stone platforms on top of one another, creating a towering structure that rose high above the desert. This became the step pyramid of Djoser, the first pyramid ever constructed. The mastermind behind this project was the brilliant architect Imhotep, who served as Djoser's chief advisor. Imhotep's design represented a radical departure from earlier building methods. Instead of mud brick, the pyramid used cut limestone blocks, carefully arranged in massive layers. This marked the beginning of large-scale stone architecture in Egypt. The step pyramid complex was enormous. It included courtyards, ceremonial temples, storage rooms, and protective walls stretching hundreds of meters across the desert. But this was only the beginning. Over the next few centuries, Egyptian engineers refined pyramid construction, gradually transforming step designs into smooth-sided geometric structures. The most famous of these projects took place during the reign of Khufu around 2560 BC. Khufu ordered the construction of what would become the largest pyramid ever built, the Great Pyramid of Giza. Located on the plateau of Giza, this monumental structure originally stood about 146 meters tall and contained an estimated 2.3 million stone blocks. Some of these blocks weighed more than 15 tons. The construction of the pyramid required extraordinary organization. Contrary to popular myth, the builders were not enslaved masses. Archaeological evidence shows that many workers were actually skilled laborers who lived in nearby villages and were supplied with food, housing, and medical care. Teams of laborers worked in rotating shifts, especially during the annual Nile flood season when farmland was underwater and agricultural work paused. Engineers used ramps, sledges, ropes, and careful planning to move massive stones from quarries to the construction site. Copper tools, chisels, saws, and drills played a crucial role in shaping limestone blocks. Once placed, the outer surface of the pyramid was covered with polished white limestone that reflected sunlight brilliantly. In ancient times, the pyramid would have shone across the desert like a giant mirror. And the Great Pyramid was not alone. Khufu's successors built additional pyramids beside it. His son Khafre constructed the second pyramid at Giza, which still appears slightly taller today because it sits on higher ground. Nearby stands one of the most mysterious monuments of the ancient world, the Great Sphinx of Giza, a colossal statue carved from bedrock with the body of a lion and the face believed to represent Khafre himself. These structures formed part of a massive ceremonial complex that included temples, causeways, and burial chambers designed to guide the pharaoh safely into the afterlife. But the construction of such monuments required more than just faith. That it required resources. Stone, copper tools, wood, food supplies, and skilled workers all had to be organized and transported across large distances. This meant Egypt needed trade networks connecting it to the wider Bronze Age world. Copper was imported from the Sinai Peninsula and possibly from regions farther east. Timber, scarce in Egypt's deserts, was brought from the forests of Lebanon, particularly the famous cedar trees used for construction and shipbuilding. Egyptian ships also traveled south along the Nile and across the Red Sea, trading with lands rich in gold, incense, and exotic goods. These connections tied Egypt into the expanding network of Bronze Age civilizations that stretched across Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the eastern Mediterranean. But even as Egypt reached incredible heights of wealth and engineering achievement, the world beyond its borders was continuing to evolve. Far to the east, another great civilization was rising along the rivers of the Indian subcontinent, but a civilization that would build vast cities with planned streets, advanced sanitation systems, and enormous trade connections. That it would become one of the largest societies of the Bronze Age, the Indus Valley Civilization. And its cities would soon rival the greatest urban centers of Mesopotamia and Egypt. While the kingdoms of Egypt were building pyramids, and the cities of Mesopotamia were expanding under powerful kings, another remarkable civilization was quietly rising thousands of kilometers to the east. That it developed along the wide river systems of the Indus River and its tributaries in what is now Pakistan and northwest India. Today we call it the Indus Valley Civilization. Its height. Between 2600 BC and 1900 BC, this civilization covered an enormous area, larger than both ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. Hundreds of settlements spread across a region stretching from the Arabian Sea deep into the plains of South Asia. But what makes the Indus civilization truly remarkable is not just its size. That it is how carefully its cities were planned. Point one of the greatest of these cities was Mohenjo-Daro, located in modern Pakistan. When archaeologists first uncovered its ruins in the 1920s, they were stunned by what they found. The entire city appeared to have been designed according to a grid system. Streets ran in straight lines, intersecting each other at right angles. Large avenues divided the city into organized blocks. Houses were built from standardized baked bricks of nearly identical size. This level of urban planning was astonishing for its time. Many homes even had 2 or 3 stories, with interior courtyards and private wells. Some houses contain their own bathing areas connected to covered drainage channels. And this leads to one of the most impressive features of Indus cities: sanitation. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-daro was connected to a sophisticated drainage system. Wastewater flowed through covered brick channels beneath the streets and emptied outside the city walls. Inspection shafts allowed workers to clean the drains when necessary. In many parts of the world, cities would not develop sanitation systems this advanced for thousands of years. At the center of Mohenjo-daro stood a remarkable structure known today as the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro. This enormous brick-lined pool measured about 12 meters long and 7 meters wide. Waterproof bitumen sealed the bricks, preventing leaks. Wide staircases allowed people to descend into the water. The exact purpose of the Great Bath is still debated. These individuals appear to have willingly followed their king or queen into death, possibly through ritual sacrifice. They were arranged neatly in rows, wearing fine clothing and jewelry, as if participating in a final ceremony. This chilling practice reveals the immense power that rulers held over their societies. Kings were no longer just administrators. They were seen as divinely chosen leaders, sometimes even semi-divine themselves. Their authority extended across armies, temples, trade networks, and entire populations. And yet, despite their growing power, the Sumerian city-states remained divided. For centuries, they competed with one another for dominance across the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Alliances formed and collapsed. Victories were followed by defeats. Cities rose to power only to fall again. But eventually, one leader would accomplish something none of the others had managed before. He would unite many of these cities under a single empire. And in doing so, he would create the first true empire in human history. His name was Sargon of Akkad, and his rise would change the political map of the ancient world forever. For centuries, the cities of southern Mesopotamia had competed with one another for power. Uruk, Uar, Lagash, and Kish all fought for influence across the fertile plains between the rivers. Each city controlled farmland, irrigation canals, and its own army of bronze-armed soldiers. Kings rose to power, won battles, and then were eventually defeated by rival rulers. For hundreds of years, the political map of Mesopotamia looked like a constantly shifting chessboard, and no single city could dominate the others for long. But around 2334 BC, a man appeared who would change that pattern forever. His name was Sargon of Akkad. Unlike many rulers before him, Sargon did not come from a long royal dynasty. Later legends claim he was born to a humble family and abandoned as an infant in a basket placed upon the river, a story that echoes through later myths in many cultures. According to these traditions, he was rescued and raised by a gardener before eventually entering royal service. While the exact details of his early life are uncertain, historical records confirm that Sargon began his career as a cupbearer to the king of Kish. In ancient courts, this position was far more important than the title suggests. A cupbearer was a trusted official who served close to the king, often acting as an advisor and administrator. From this position of influence, Sargon eventually seized power. But instead of ruling a single city-state like earlier kings, he envisioned something far more ambitious. He would unite all of Mesopotamia under one authority. To accomplish this, Sargon needed a powerful and disciplined army. Unlike the temporary militias used by many earlier cities, Sargon organized a standing military force. Professional soldiers who trained and fought as a permanent unit rather than returning to farms after battles. These soldiers carried bronze weapons produced in centralized workshops. Spears tipped with bronze blades formed the backbone of Akkadian infantry. Axes and daggers served as secondary weapons in close combat. Soldiers wore helmets and carried shields made from wood and leather. But the strength of Sargon's army was not just its equipment, it was organization. Instead of loose groups of fighters, Akkadian soldiers marched in coordinated formations. Officers commanded units. Campaigns were planned with strategy rather than spontaneous raids. Supply lines carried food and equipment across long distances. With this military machine, Sargon began conquering city after city. He defeated the powerful kingdom of Uruk, whose kings had once dominated southern Mesopotamia. He subdued Ur, capturing its wealth and resources. One by one, the independent Sumerian city-states fell beneath his rule. But Sargon did not stop there. His armies pushed north into Akkad, the region that would give his empire its name. From there, they expanded west toward the Mediterranean coast and east into the highlands of the Zagros Mountains. At its height, Sargon's empire stretched across thousands of kilometers. For the first time in human history, multiple cultures, languages, and cities were governed under a single imperial system. But conquest alone could not hold such a vast territory together. Sargon needed an administrative system capable of controlling distant regions. And this is where earlier inventions like cuneiform became essential. Across the empire, scribes recorded taxes, shipments, agricultural production, and military logistics on clay tablets. Governors appointed by the emperor ruled provincial cities while sending reports back to the imperial center. Roads and trade routes were protected by Akkadian troops to ensure merchants could move goods safely across long distances. This stability allowed commerce to flourish on a scale never seen before. Caravans traveled across deserts carrying copper from the mountains of Anatolia. Tin arrived from distant eastern regions, possibly including modern Afghanistan and Central Asia. Timber, rare stones, textiles, and luxury goods flowed through the markets of Mesopotamian cities. Bronze production expanded dramatically as these trade routes connected metal sources across the ancient world. The empire even extended its influence to maritime trade. Ships sailed through the Persian Gulf, linking Mesopotamian cities with distant lands such as Dilmun, Magan, and the mysterious civilization known as Malua. From these regions came copper, exotic woods, ivory, precious stones, and other rare materials that enriched the Akkadian economy. But maintaining such a vast empire was incredibly difficult. Rebellions broke out frequently. Some cities resisted imperial control. Distant provinces required constant military presence. Even nature itself sometimes turned against the empire as droughts and environmental changes affected agriculture. Sargon ruled for more than 5 decades, an astonishing length of time for an ancient conqueror. By the end of his life, he had created a political structure unlike anything humanity had seen before. His empire proved that centralized authority could control vast territories, coordinate economies across regions, and maintain large professional armies. Future empires would follow the model he created. After Sargon's death, his sons and grandsons attempted to maintain the empire he built. Some, like Naram-Sin, even declared themselves divine rulers, portraying their authority as granted directly by the gods. Under Naram-Sin, Akkadian armies continued expanding and suppressing rebellions. Monumental stone reliefs carved during his reign show him wearing a horned crown, a symbol normally reserved for deities. But despite these displays of power, cracks were beginning to form in the imperial system. Distant territories became harder to control. Internal revolts weakened the central government. Trade routes were disrupted by instability and environmental pressures. Eventually, new groups migrating from the surrounding highlands began attacking Mesopotamian cities. Among these were the mysterious Gudians, whose raids destabilized the empire. By around 2150 BC, the Akkadian Empire collapsed. Cities that had once been united under a single ruler once again became independent. But the idea of empire, the concept that vast territories could be ruled by a centralized authority, had already changed the course of human history, and the world of the Bronze Age was still expanding. While Mesopotamia experienced cycles of empire and collapse, other powerful civilizations were rising elsewhere. Along the fertile banks of another great river far to the west, an entirely different kingdom was building monuments so massive they would astonish humanity for thousands of years. Stone structures rising hundreds of feet into the sky. Monuments built for kings who believed they would rule forever. The land was Egypt. And there, the next chapter of the Bronze Age would unfold with the construction of the pyramids. While the great empires of Mesopotamia were rising and falling between the Tigris River and the Euphrates River, another civilization was developing along a very different landscape. Far to the west, a narrow green ribbon cut through an otherwise endless desert. Every year, its waters flooded the surrounding land, depositing rich layers of fertile soil before slowly retreating. This river was the Nile River. In return, laborers built canals, maintained irrigation systems, produced pottery, and worked in metal workshops. This system allowed Uruk to support enormous numbers of people who did not farm. Specialization began expanding rapidly. Some individuals became full-time potters. Others were scribes, builders, weavers, metalworkers, or merchants. Entire districts of the city were devoted to specific industries. Pottery production reached an unprecedented scale. Archaeologists have discovered massive quantities of a simple clay vessel known as the beveled rim bowl. These bowls were produced quickly using molds rather than hand shaping. They appear everywhere in Uruk's archaeological layers, sometimes in piles of thousands. Most historians believe these bowls were used to distribute standardized food rations to workers. Instead of being paid with coins or currency, laborers received measured portions of grain or bread. This system required careful administration, and that need led to one of the most important inventions in human history, writing at first. Administrators used small clay tokens to represent quantities of goods. A certain shape might represent a sheep. Another might represent a measure of grain. These tokens were placed inside clay envelopes called bulli to record transactions. But this system quickly became inefficient. Instead of sealing tokens inside envelopes, someone eventually had a simple idea: press the shapes directly into wet clay to record them. From these impressions emerged the earliest known writing system, called cuneiform at first. Cuneiform was not used for stories or literature. It was used for accounting. Early tablets record things like grain deliveries, livestock, inventories, worker rations, trade shipment. Scribes used reed styluses to press wedge-shaped marks into wet clay tablets. When the tablets dried in the sun, the records became permanent. This breakthrough transformed administration. For the first time, governments could track resources across large populations and long periods of time. Economic systems became far more complex and organized, and Uruk's influence began spreading far beyond its walls. Archaeologists have discovered Uruk-style pottery, architecture, and administrative tablets hundreds of kilometers away in places like northern Mesopotamia, Syria, and Anatolia. This phenomenon is often called the Uruk expansion. Merchants, craftsmen, and administrators from Uruk appear to have established trading colonies in distant settlements. These outposts helped secure vital resources the city lacked locally. Because southern Mesopotamia had almost no natural stone, timber, or metal deposits, copper had to be imported, tin had to be imported, wood for construction had to be imported. Uruk's merchants traveled far beyond the river plains. Trade routes stretched north into Anatolia, east toward the Zagros Mountains, and south toward the Persian Gulf. From these regions came copper or precious stones, timber, and exotic materials. In return, Uruk exported textiles, pottery, grain, and crafted goods. The city became the beating heart of a growing economic world, and with wealth came power. Around 3000 BC, Uruk built one of the earliest known city walls in history. According to later tradition, the walls stretched more than 9 kilometers around the city. The construction of such enormous fortifications required staggering amounts of labor and organization. Ancient legends would later attribute these walls to a powerful ruler, the king whose story would echo across thousands of years. His name was Gilgamesh, although the historical details of his life remain uncertain. Later Mesopotamian literature portrays him as a mighty ruler who strengthened the city and undertook legendary adventures. The story known as the Epic of Gilgamesh would eventually become the oldest surviving piece of literature in human history. But behind the myths and legends lies a deeper truth. Uruk represented a turning point in human civilization. For the first time, cities contained tens of thousands of people. Governments managed complex economies. Writing recorded human knowledge. Trade networks connected distant cultures. Metal technology shaped tools, weapons, and power. Human society had entered a completely new phase. And yet the world of the Bronze Age was only beginning. Within the next 1,000 years, powerful kingdoms would rise across Mesopotamia, Egypt, Anatolia, and the Indus Valley. Trade would stretch across entire seas. Armies equipped with bronze weapons would clash in wars that shaped the ancient world. The age of cities, kings, and empires had begun. As Uruk's influence spread across Mesopotamia, another transformation began taking place inside the growing cities themselves. What had once been temple-center communities slowly started developing a new form of leadership. For centuries, priests and temple officials had organized irrigation systems, collected agricultural goods, and managed labor projects. But as populations grew and competition between cities increased, something new became necessary. Stronger leadership. Someone had to organize armies. Someone had to defend trade routes. Someone had to negotiate with rival cities. And from this need emerged the first true kings. This new political era is known today as the early dynastic period of Sumer. During this time, southern Mesopotamia was not a single unified kingdom. Instead, it was divided into a network of powerful city-states. Each city functioned almost like its own small nation, complete with its own ruler, army, temples, and territory. Among the most important of these cities were Ur, Lagash, Kish, and Uruk itself. Each city was surrounded by farmland that supported its population. Irrigation canals stretched across the landscape like veins carrying life-giving water to the fields. Control of these canals became a constant source of conflict, because whoever controlled the water controlled the harvest, and whoever controlled the harvest controlled the people. Rival cities frequently clashed over farmland, canal routes, and trade access. These were not small skirmishes between scattered villages anymore. They were organized conflicts involving trained soldiers, weapons, and strategic planning. Archaeological evidence from this period reveals the appearance of standing armies. One of the most famous artifacts showing this transformation is the Standard of Ur, discovered in the Royal Cemetery of Ur. One side of the object shows scenes of war. Rows of soldiers wearing helmets and carrying long spears march in formation, while chariots roll across the battlefield, crushing defeated enemies beneath their wheels. These images show something important. War had become systematic and organized. Soldiers carried bronze-tipped spears and axes. Shields were made from wood covered with leather. Helmets were often crafted from copper or bronze. Military formations appeared disciplined, suggesting training and command structures. The rise of bronze weapons played a major role in this development. Cities that controlled strong metal production or trade routes had major advantages. Metalworkers in urban workshops produced swords, spearheads, and armor in increasing numbers. Bronze tools also improved agriculture, which allowed cities to support larger populations and armies. But warfare alone did not define these early kingdoms. They also created some of the most impressive architectural achievements of the ancient world. Temples grew larger and more elaborate. Palaces began appearing beside them. Massive buildings that served as royal residences and administrative centers. These structures often contained dozens of rooms arranged around courtyards, storage areas, and audience halls where rulers received visitors and officials. One of the most fascinating discoveries from this era is the Royal Cemetery of Ur, where archaeologists uncovered spectacular burials filled with gold jewelry, musical instruments, chariots, and ceremonial weapons. These graves belonged to powerful rulers and elites who lived around 2600 BC. Some tombs contained elaborate headdresses made of gold leaves and precious stones. Others held lyres decorated with carved animal heads. The sheer wealth buried with these individuals shows how dramatically social hierarchies had grown. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of these tombs is something else entirely. In several royal graves, archaeologists discovered the remains of dozens of attendants buried alongside the ruler. The story of copper had only just begun, and the innovations sparked during this era would echo through human history for thousands of years to come. For thousands of years, copper had been the most advanced material humans knew how to shape. It could be heated, hammered, and molded into tools that were stronger and more durable than stone. Entire trade networks had grown around it. Mines had been opened across mountains. Workshops had appeared in cities and villages alike. But copper had one major weakness: that it was still relatively soft. A copper blade dulled quickly. A copper axe could bend after repeated use. For farming tools, knives, and decorative objects, this was often acceptable. But as societies became more complex, people began searching for stronger materials, especially for weapons and heavy tools. The solution did not arrive through a planned scientific experiment. The IT came through accident. Somewhere in the ancient world, probably sometime around 3300 to 3000 BC, a metalworker smelted copper or that happened to contain another mineral mixed within it. When the metal cooled and was shaped into a tool, something strange happened. The finished object was harder than normal copper. IT held its edge longer. IT resisted bending. The IT performed better in almost every way. What the metalworker had unknowingly created was bronze, an alloy formed when copper is combined with another metal, most commonly tin. From a modern perspective, this may sound simple, but for early metallurgists, the discovery was revolutionary. Pure copper melts at about 1085 degrees Celsius, a temperature already difficult to achieve with ancient furnaces. But when copper is mixed with tin in the right proportions, the resulting alloy becomes not only stronger, but also easier to cast into complex shapes. Bronze flows more smoothly when molten. It fills molds more completely. It cools into harder edges and sharper blades. In other words, it was the perfect material for tools and weapons. First, this discovery spread slowly. Early bronze objects appear in small numbers across several regions, including Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the Caucasus Mountains. These earliest examples often contain small amounts of tin or arsenic mixed naturally within copper ores. Some of the earliest arsenic bronze artifacts come from sites in eastern Anatolia and Iran. When copper or containing arsenic impurities was smelted, the resulting metal became significantly harder. Craftsmen may have noticed that certain sources produced superior tools and began seeking them out deliberately. But arsenic bronze had a serious drawback. The smelting process released toxic arsenic fumes. Metal workers exposed to these vapors could suffer serious health effects, including nerve damage and chronic illness. Over time, metallurgists discovered that adding tin produced an even better alloy without the same dangers. This shift created an entirely new problem. Tin was extremely rare. Unlike copper, which could be found in many mountainous regions, tin deposits were scattered and limited. Major ancient sources existed in places like Central Asia, Anatolia, Afghanistan, and possibly parts of Britain and Central Europe. This meant that producing bronze required connecting distant mining regions through long-distance trade networks. Copper might come from one location. Tin might come from another hundreds or even thousands of kilometers away. Merchants had to transport these materials across mountains, deserts, and seas. The demand for bronze therefore fueled an enormous expansion of trade. Caravans began traveling across the highlands of Iran and Anatolia, carrying metal ores, textiles, and precious stones. Riverboats moved cargo along the Tigris and Euphrates. Seafaring merchants crossed the eastern Mediterranean, transporting copper ingots shaped like large ox hides, flat slabs with four handles that made them easier to carry and stack. These oxhide ingots would later become one of the most recognizable trade goods of the Bronze Age. Archaeologists have discovered them in shipwrecks, coastal settlements, and inland trade centers. Some weigh more than 25 kilograms, representing enormous value in ancient economies. The scale of metal production increased dramatically. Mines expanded deeper into mountains. Smelting facilities grew larger. Specialized craftsmen appeared whose entire profession focused on metalworking. Entire communities sometimes formed around mining operations in regions rich with copper, or the landscape itself began changing. Ancient mining sites like Timna Valley in the southern Levant, huge piles of dark slag. The waste product of smelting still cover the ground today. These slag heaps represent centuries of continuous metal production. Some ancient mines followed copper veins deep underground using stone hammers and fire-setting techniques. Workers would heat rock with intense fires and then rapidly cool it with water, causing the stone to crack and making it easier to break apart. Mining was dangerous work. Tunnels could collapse. Toxic gases could accumulate in poorly ventilated shafts. But the value of metal was so great that communities continued expanding these operations despite the risks. As bronze tools spread across the ancient world, they triggered profound changes in daily life. Farmers could now use stronger plows capable of breaking tougher soils. Harvesting tools remained sharp longer, improving agricultural productivity. Builders gained chisels and saws that allowed more precise woodworking and stone carving. But perhaps the most dramatic transformation occurred in warfare. Bronze swords, spearheads, shields, and armor appeared in increasing numbers across ancient battlefields. Weapons that once shattered or bent during combat were replaced by stronger designs capable of delivering devastating blows. Military power became closely tied to access to metal resources. Kings and rulers began controlling mines, trade routes, and metal workshops as strategic assets. Armies equipped with superior bronze weapons could dominate rivals who still relied on stone or copper tools. This shift helped fuel the rise of powerful states throughout the ancient Near East. Cities grew larger. Palaces appeared. Monumental architecture began rising across landscapes from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Anatolia. And at the center of many of these developments stood a city that would soon become the largest urban settlement the world had ever seen. Located along the Euphrates River in southern Mesopotamia, it began as a modest temple town surrounded by fertile farmland. But by around 3000 BC, its population was exploding. Its temples towered above surrounding neighborhoods. Its markets attracted merchants from distant lands. Its workshops produced pottery, textiles, and metal tools in enormous quantities. This city would soon give birth to the world's first writing system, one of humanity's greatest inventions. Its name was Uruk, and in the next chapter of this story, the rise of Uruk would show how metallurgy, trade, religion, and political power combined to create the first true urban civilization in human history. The Bronze Age slowly took shape. One city began to rise above all others. Located along the banks of the Euphrates River, in what is now southern Iraq, a settlement that had once been little more than a temple village began transforming into something the world had never seen before. Its name was Uruk. Around 3500 to 3000 BC, Uruk experienced an explosion in growth. What had once been a modest community expanded into a vast urban center covering more than 250 hectares, making it the largest city on Earth at the time. Tens of thousands of people lived within its walls. Farmers, craftsmen, traders, priests, laborers, and administrators. For the first time in human history, a true city civilization had emerged. The heart of Uruk stood enormous temple complexes dedicated to powerful deities. The most famous of these was the temple district of Inanna, the goddess of love, war, and political power. Her temple dominated the skyline, sitting atop massive platforms that elevated it above the surrounding city. These early platforms were the ancestors of the great Mesopotamian ziggurats that would appear later. But these temples were not simply religious centers. They were economic engines. Priests and administrators managed huge agricultural estates surrounding the city. Farmers delivered grain, wool, and livestock as offerings or taxes. These resources were stored in temple granaries and redistributed to workers throughout the city. The people of Troy had both the resources and the leadership necessary to mobilize large numbers of workers for major construction projects. Inside the walls, the houses reflected this prosperity. Unlike the small one-room huts common in many prehistoric villages, Trojan homes often contained multiple rooms arranged around central hearths. Stone foundations supported timber-framed upper walls and roofs. Storage areas held large quantities of goods, grain, pottery, and trade commodities waiting to be transported elsewhere. Many houses also contained workshops is inside these workshops that we see the growing importance of metallurgy. Copper objects discovered at Troy include axes, chisels, knives, pins, and decorative ornaments. Some show complex shapes that required careful casting and finishing. These were not crude tools made quickly for local use. They were crafted products created by skilled artisans who understood how metal behaved during heating, pouring, and cooling. Chemical analysis of these artifacts reveals something even more interesting. The copper used by Trojan craftsmen came from multiple different mining regions. Some were originated in the Taurus Mountains to the south. Other material appears to have come from the Pontic Mountains in the northeast. This means that Troy was not simply using nearby resources, that it was part of a wide network of trade connections stretching hundreds of kilometers across Anatolia and beyond. The settlement had become a redistribution center where raw materials arrived from distant sources, were transformed by local craftsmen, and then sent onward to other communities. But Troy's influence was not limited to land-based trade. During this period, maritime technology was advancing rapidly throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Early seafaring communities had already been navigating coastal waters for thousands of years, but by the late 4th millennium BC, ships were becoming larger, more capable, and more reliable. Archaeological evidence suggests that wooden vessels used for long-distance travel during this period were typically between 15 and 20 meters in length. They were built using planks fastened together over sturdy wooden frames. Their shallow drafts allowed them to move through rivers and coastal waters with ease. These ships could carry significant cargo loads: pottery, metal ingots, agricultural goods, textiles, and other valuable materials. And Troy stood directly beside one of the most important maritime choke points in the region, its narrowest. The Dardanelles Strait measures only about 1.5 kilometers wide. Ships traveling between the Black Sea and the Aegean Sea would naturally pass close to the Trojan settlement. This gave the inhabitants enormous economic advantages. They could monitor shipping traffic, they could trade with passing vessels, and they could act as intermediaries between northern and southern markets. Over time, this position helped transform Troy into one of the most influential commercial hubs of its era. But controlling maritime trade required more than just a good location. Sailors navigating open waters needed reliable methods for finding their way across vast distances. Without compasses or modern instruments, early navigators relied on careful observation of natural signals. The position of the sun during the day, the movement of stars during the night, wind patterns, the shape of coastlines. Some coastal communities even began constructing visible landmarks to help guide ships safely along their routes. Archaeological research on islands such as Lemnos and Lesbos suggests that signal fires may have been used to mark dangerous passages or important harbors. At night, these fires would glow along the coastline, creating a chain of visible markers that sailors could follow across the dark sea. Such systems dramatically improved the safety of maritime travel and allowed ships to venture farther from shore than before. As sea trade expanded, coastal settlements throughout Anatolia began investing in harbor infrastructure. At places like Limontepe on the western Anatolian coast, archaeologists have uncovered stone-built quays and breakwaters dating back thousands of years. These harbor facilities included mooring posts where ships could be tied securely in storage buildings where cargo could be loaded, unloaded, and protected from weather. Constructing such installations required impressive engineering knowledge. Builders had to understand tidal patterns, wave forces, and the structural strength of stone walls exposed to constant water movement. All of this activity reflects a broader economic transformation spreading across the region. Trade was becoming the lifeblood of many communities as demand for copper tools and other goods increased. Inland settlements began producing items specifically intended for export. One such site was Bey Sultan in southwestern Anatolia. Excavations there have revealed a large settlement that flourished around 3200 BC. Defensive walls surrounded the town. Large storage buildings held agricultural products. Workshop areas contained molds and furnace remains used for producing copper tools. The pottery discovered at Bey Sultan is particularly revealing. Many vessels appear designed for transportation and storage rather than everyday domestic use. Their shapes and standardized sizes suggest they were part of a structured trade system where goods were measured, packaged, and shipped in predictable quantities. In other words, trade was becoming increasingly organized. But perhaps the most dramatic sign of changing political structures in Anatolia comes from a site known as Arslantepe, located in eastern Turkey. Around 3350 BC, A monumental complex was constructed there unlike anything previously seen in the region. This enormous building covered more than 1,000 square meters and included multiple rooms, corridors, and decorated halls. Its walls were adorned with painted murals. Stone relief carvings decorated important spaces. The entire structure required a level of planning and labor coordination far beyond what small village communities could manage. Arslantepe appears to represent one of the earliest examples of centralized political authority in Anatolia. Inside the complex, archaeologists discovered administrative rooms filled with clay seal impressions used to control access to stored goods. Large standardized storage vessels suggest that officials were collecting and redistributing resources on a regional scale. This was bureaucracy in its earliest form. Even more interesting are the metallurgical workshops associated with the complex. Furnaces capable of processing large amounts of copper or have been uncovered along with molds used to create standardized tools and weapons. These discoveries suggest that metal production was being organized under centralized supervision, instead of individual craftsmen working independently within households. Entire workshops may have operated under the authority of political leaders who controlled access to raw materials and oversaw distribution of finished goods. Metal had become more than craft at IT had become a tool of governance. Copper tools and weapons produced at these facilities could be distributed to farmers, builders, or warriors, depending on the needs of the ruling authority. This allowed leaders to strengthen their power while ensuring that key economic activities continued smoothly. Why this point in human history? Something remarkable had happened. What began thousands of years earlier as curious experimentation with strange greenish stones had grown into a complex network of mining operations, workshops, trade routes, political centers, and maritime economies stretching across vast regions. Copper had quietly reshaped the world. IT connected distant cultures. IT encouraged technological innovation. IT helped create social hierarchies and political institutions. And perhaps most importantly, it prepared humanity for the next great leap in technological development. Because somewhere, sometime soon, ancient metallurgists would make another accidental discovery. One that would produce a metal stronger and more durable than pure copper, a discovery that would usher humanity into a completely new age, the Bronze Age. But that transformation would not happen instantly. It would emerge gradually as craftsmen experimented with new materials, trade routes expanded even farther, and civilizations grew larger and more powerful. When archaeologists excavated Eridu, they uncovered a remarkable sequence of buildings stacked on top of one another. 18 separate construction layers representing nearly 2,000 years of continuous occupation. The earliest levels contained simple structures made of reeds and mud, typical of marsh-dwelling communities. But over time, the buildings became larger and more sophisticated. By around 4500 BC, the settlement contained solid mud brick houses, organized streets, and an increasingly important structure rising at its center, a temple. This temple would be rebuilt again and again over centuries, each new version larger than the last. Eventually, it grew into a complex that dominated the settlement both physically and socially. Temples in these early Mesopotamian communities were far more than places of worship. They functioned as administrative centers, economic hubs, and organizational headquarters for large-scale projects. And one of the most important of those projects was irrigation. Unlike rain-fed farming in many parts of Europe, agriculture in southern Mesopotamia depended on controlling river water. The Tigris and Euphrates flooded annually, depositing fertile silt but also threatening crops with unpredictable surges. To harness this water effectively, communities began constructing canal systems that diverted river water into fields while preventing destructive floods. These canals could stretch for kilometers across the landscape. They required careful planning, excavation, and constant maintenance. Gates had to regulate water flow. Drainage channels prevented fields from becoming waterlogged or salty. The scale of these systems was unlike anything earlier agricultural societies had attempted. Building them required large groups of workers organized into coordinated labor teams. Someone had to supervise construction, assign tasks, distribute food to workers, and resolve disputes over water rights. The temple institutions gradually took on these responsibilities. Religious authority gave temple leaders the power to organize communities around collective goals. Farmers contributed labor to canal construction. In return, they received access to irrigated land capable of producing reliable harvests. The result was remarkable agricultural productivity. With irrigation, farmers could grow crops year-round rather than relying on unpredictable seasonal rains. Wheat, barley, legumes, and other plants thrived in the fertile soil. Surplus grain could be stored in massive granaries within temple complexes. For the first time, communities began producing far more food than they immediately needed. This surplus changed everything. Extra food meant some people no longer had a farm. Instead, they could specialize in other professions: potters, weavers, traders, builders, and metalworkers. Copper working, which had begun centuries earlier in Anatolia and the Balkans, found a new home within these Mesopotamian settlements. Workshops appeared near temple complexes where craftsmen produced tools, weapons, and ceremonial objects. These workshops reveal a high level of organization. Archaeologists have uncovered furnace installations, slag deposits, casting molds, and partially completed metal objects. The layout of these spaces suggests that production followed a sequence of steps for preparation: smelting, casting, finishing. Each stage may have been handled by different specialists. The copper objects produced in these workshops included axes, chisels, knives, vessels, and decorative ornaments. Some artifacts show evidence of alloying, mixing copper with small amounts of arsenic or tin to produce harder metal, an early step toward the development of bronze. Although southern Mesopotamia had no local metal deposits, its growing economic power allowed it to import copper from distant regions. Trade networks connected the river cities with mining areas in Anatolia, the Zagros Mountains, and the Arabian Peninsula. Boats traveling along rivers and across the Persian Gulf carried raw materials, finished goods, and cultural ideas between communities separated by hundreds of kilometers. This expansion of trade also required new administrative tools. Although true, writing had not yet developed. Mesopotamian administrators began using clay tokens and seals to record transactions and mark ownership. Small clay objects represented quantities of goods, while cylinder seals stamped unique patterns into wet clay to authenticate storage containers or trade shipments. These early accounting methods laid the groundwork for one of humanity's most important inventions: writing at the same time. Competition between communities for control of trade routes and fertile land began producing the earliest clear evidence of organized warfare in the region. Strategic settlements built defensive walls. Some locations show signs of destruction followed by rapid rebuilding. Weapons made of copper, axes, spearheads, and mace heads appear more frequently in archaeological layers from this period. Despite these conflicts, Mesopotamian society continued growing steadily rather than collapsing. The irrigation systems created a stable agricultural base. Temple institutions coordinated economic activity. Trade networks ensured the flow of raw materials. By around 3500 BC, the foundations were firmly in place for a dramatic transformation. Settlements would soon expand into full-scale cities. Monumental architecture would rise above the plains. Writing would appear for the first time, and copper metallurgy would evolve even further as new techniques spread across the ancient world. Meanwhile, far to the north in Anatolia, communities positioned between Europe and the Near East were beginning to take advantage of their geographic location. Sitting between two continents and two seas, these settlements would become crucial intermediaries in the growing metal trade. One of them stood on a limestone ridge overlooking a narrow strait, where ships passed between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. That settlement would later become legendary. Its name was Troy, and its strategic position would soon place it at the center of one of the most important trade networks of the ancient world. While the river civilizations of Mesopotamia were slowly building irrigation systems and temple economies, the lands to the north were experiencing a very different transformation. Anatolia, the vast peninsula connecting Europe and Asia, had become one of the most strategically important regions in the ancient world. Its mountains contained valuable mineral deposits. Its valleys linked major trade routes, and its narrow waterways controlled the passage between entire seas. Communities living there suddenly found themselves sitting at the crossroads of expanding civilizations. Among the most important of these settlements was one built on a rocky ridge overlooking a narrow stretch of water known today as the Dardanelles. This strait forms a natural gateway between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Ships traveling between these regions had little choice but to pass through this narrow corridor. Whoever controlled this location controlled movement between two vast maritime worlds. The settlement that rose here would later become famous in myth and legend. But long before epic poems were written about it, long before warriors and heroes were imagined fighting beneath its walls, it was already an important center of trade and craftsmanship. Its name was Troy, WY around 3500 BC. The early levels of Troy were already showing signs of remarkable prosperity. Archaeologists refer to these phases as Troy I and Troy II, and even at this early stage the settlement was far more advanced than many surrounding communities. Massive stone walls protected the town. These were not simple barriers thrown together quickly. They were carefully constructed fortifications made from large limestone blocks fitted together with impressive skill. Some of these stones weighed several tons. Moving them required organized labor forces and careful planning. This alone tells us something important. The most spectacular examples appeared within the Cucuteni, Tripilia culture, a civilization that stretched across what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine. Here, archaeologists would eventually discover settlements so vast that they completely changed our understanding of prehistoric population limits. One of these places, known as Talianki, covered more than 335 hectares. At its peak around 4100 BC, it may have supported as many as 15,000 inhabitants. For comparison, that population would rival many cities thousands of years later. When researchers used modern magnetometer scanning to map the site beneath the soil, they discovered an astonishing layout. More than 1,600 buildings arranged in concentric rings surrounding a large central plaza. Each ring contained clusters of houses dedicated to specific activities. Some areas focused on pottery production, others specialized in textile weaving. Still others contained workshops where metal objects were crafted. The houses themselves were impressive structures built using timber frameworks covered with woven branches and clay, a technique known as wattle and daub. Many measured between 8 and 12 meters long and contained multiple rooms. Ground floors often serve as workspaces and storage areas, while upper floors provided living quarters for extended families. Inside these homes, archaeologists discovered ovens, storage containers, weaving tools, and evidence of daily life for thousands of people living side by side in carefully organized neighborhoods. But perhaps the most visually striking achievement of these communities was their pottery. Cucuteni, Tripilia ceramics are among the most beautiful ever produced in prehistoric Europe. The vessels display intricate spirals, swirling geometric patterns, and flowing designs painted in red and black against pale backgrounds. Creating these decorations required remarkable control of firing temperatures and multiple stages of ceramic processing. Pottery had evolved from simple storage containers into a form of artistic expression. Entire cultural identities were being expressed through patterns and shapes painted onto clay, and the scale of production was enormous. At sites like Nebelivka, archaeologists discovered massive pottery kilns capable of firing hundreds of vessels at once. Waste deposits contain millions of broken fragments representing thousands of completed pots. This level of production suggests something extraordinary. Pottery manufacturing had become almost industrial in scale. Clay for these vessels was sometimes transported from quarries as far as 50 kilometers away. That required organized procurement systems and coordinated labor teams. The world of the Copper Age was becoming larger, more complex, and more interconnected with every passing generation. But beneath this prosperity, subtle pressures were beginning to build. Environmental conditions that had supported population growth would not remain stable forever. trade networks could shift, resources could become scarce, and the enormous settlements that represented humanity's first experiments with urban scale living were far more fragile than they appeared. Within a few centuries, many of these great communities would vanish from the landscape, leaving behind only burned houses, abandoned workshops, and the silent remains of a civilization that had once pushed the limits of prehistoric society. And while Europe would soon face the collapse of these early megasettlements, something entirely different was beginning far to the south, between two rivers whose floods shaped the destiny of another region. There, in the fertile plains between the Tigris and Euphrates, a new type of society was quietly forming. Point one that would soon create the first true cities in human history. As impressive as the great settlements of southeastern Europe had become, their prosperity depended on a delicate balance. Huge populations required steady harvests, reliable trade routes, and stable environmental conditions. For a time, those conditions held, and the great Copper Age societies flourished across the Balkans and the fertile plains of Eastern Europe. But around 4200 BC, subtle cracks began appearing in the system. Across many Cucutini, Tripilia settlements, archaeologists have discovered layers of burned houses. At first, this might sound like the result of accidental fires. After all, these homes were built largely from wood, clay, and thatch. A single spark could spread quickly. But the evidence suggests something very different. Entire neighborhoods appear to have been burned deliberately. What makes this particularly strange is what happened afterward. In many cases, the burned structures were not rebuilt. The inhabitants simply abandoned the site. Huge settlements that once held thousands of people were suddenly left empty. The reason for these burning events is still debated. Some researchers believe they may have been ritual acts performed when a house reached the end of its life, a symbolic cleansing before moving elsewhere. Others suggest the fires were defensive actions during times of conflict, destroying resources so enemies could not claim them. And some scholars think they reflect social collapse caused by environmental stress. Climate records provide an important clue. Around the same time these settlements were being abandoned, the world experienced another major climatic disturbance known as the 4.2 kilo-year event. Temperatures dropped. Rainfall patterns shifted. In many regions, crops began failing more often. For agricultural societies that had grown dependent on large harvests to support thousands of people, these changes were dangerous. Even a small drop in productivity could push a community beyond its limits. The archaeological record begins to show signs of strain. Fortified settlements become more common. Evidence of violent destruction appears at multiple sites. Weapons show clear signs of combat damage. Trade routes that once carried copper, pottery, and exotic goods across long distances may have been disrupted as communities competed more aggressively for resources. The famous cemetery of Varna. The spectacular gold burials suddenly stop around 4000 BC. No later graves show the same displays of wealth. Whatever social system had allowed individuals to accumulate such immense treasures seems to have disappeared. At the same time, some copper mines that had been heavily exploited for centuries may have begun producing less high quality ore. The richest deposits are always the easiest to extract first. As those sources were exhausted, miners would have been forced to dig deeper or process poorer rock, increasing the effort required to produce metal. All these pressures combined into a profound demographic shift. Many of the giant settlements of the Cucutini, Tripilia culture were gradually abandoned. Populations dispersed into smaller villages or migrated into new regions. Within a few centuries, the enormous communities that once covered hundreds of hectares had vanished completely. Europe's first experiment with urban-scale living had ended. For thousands of years afterward, the region would not see settlements of comparable size again. The grand rings of houses, the massive pottery industries, the thriving copper workshops, all of it faded into memory, leaving behind only buried foundations and scattered artifacts. But while these societies in Europe struggled with instability and decline, another region of the ancient world was moving in a very different direction. Far to the southeast, in the wide flat plains between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, Human communities were quietly developing a new approach to survival, one that would ultimately prove far more stable. This region, known today as Mesopotamia, was both challenging and incredibly fertile. The land itself lacked stone, timber, and metal ores. Almost everything had to be imported from distant regions. But the rivers provided something else: water and rich alluvial soil, deposited by seasonal floods that, if that water could be controlled, the land could produce enormous agricultural harvests. The earliest communities of this region began experimenting with exactly that idea during a cultural phase archaeologists call the Ubaid period, which lasted roughly from 5500 to 3500 BC. First, these settlements were small farming villages located near marshlands and riverbanks. One of the earliest and most important was a place called Eridu, often considered the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. For the first time in human history, certain individuals began accumulating large amounts of precious materials, and soon this inequality would become shockingly visible, because on the shores of the Black Sea, archaeologists would eventually uncover a burial ground that revealed the birth of extreme social hierarchy, that a place where one grave contained more gold than the world had ever seen before. And when that cemetery was finally discovered, it forced historians to completely rethink when wealth, power, and inequality first emerged in human civilization. As copper slowly spread across villages and trade routes throughout southeastern Europe, something subtle but powerful was beginning to change inside human society. Metal was no longer just a useful material for tools. It was becoming something else entirely. Something symbolic. Something that could represent status, influence, and power. Nowhere is this transformation more dramatically visible than on the western coast of the Black Sea, in what is today Bulgaria, at a site known as Varna. Around 4600 BC, a community living near the sea began burying their dead in a cemetery that would eventually shock the modern world. When archaeologists excavated the site in the 20th century, they uncovered nearly 300 graves. At first glance, it seemed like a typical prehistoric burial ground. But as they carefully brushed away layers of soil and sand, something astonishing began to emerge: gold. Not a few small ornaments, not a handful of decorative pieces, but hundreds upon hundreds of gold objects. The most famous burial, known today as Grave 43, belonged to a middle-aged man. His skeleton lay surrounded by more than 990 separate gold artifacts, weighing over 1.5 kilograms in total. For perspective, this amount of gold is greater than anything found in earlier prehistoric contexts anywhere in the world. It included bracelets, beads, ornaments, decorative plates that had once been sewn onto clothing, and a ceremonial copper axe whose handle had been wrapped with gold decoration. When this man was buried, the display must have been extraordinary. His garments would have shimmered with hundreds of tiny gold pieces catching the sunlight. Jewelry adorned his body. Symbols of wealth surrounded him. Anyone witnessing the burial would have understood instantly that this individual held immense importance within his society. And yet the cemetery tells an even deeper story. Not all graves looked like this. Some burials contained rich collections of copper tools and gold ornaments. Others held only a few simple pottery vessels. And many graves contained almost nothing at all. The difference between them is striking. For the first time in the archaeological record of Europe, we can clearly see systematic social ranking. Some people possessed enormous wealth. Others had very little. Even more intriguing are the graves that contain rich collections of gold and copper objects, but no human body at all. These symbolic burials, called cenotaphs, appear to commemorate individuals whose remains were not present. Perhaps they died far from home. Perhaps they were honored leaders whose status was so great that their memory alone deserved a monumental burial. Whatever the explanation, the message is clear. By this time, access to metal had become deeply connected to social power. The craftsmen who produced these objects had developed impressive technical abilities. Early copper workers had simply hammered nuggets into shape, but by the time of the Varna culture, something revolutionary had occurred. People had discovered how to melt copper. This required temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Celsius, far hotter than ordinary campfires. Achieving such heat meant constructing specialized furnaces, controlling airflow, and carefully managing fuel sources like charcoal. Once the copper melted, it could be poured into molds, creating shapes that would have been impossible to produce through hammering alone. Axes, chisels, and decorative objects began appearing with more complex designs. The copper axes found in the richest Varna graves show evidence of both casting and hammer finishing, suggesting that craftsmen combined multiple techniques to produce durable and beautiful objects. Gold working reached an equally remarkable level of sophistication. Gold behaves differently from copper. It is softer, more resistant to corrosion, and can be hammered into extremely thin sheets without breaking. Varna goldsmiths exploited these properties with incredible skill. They created delicate ornaments, hollow beads, thin decorative plates, and complex jewelry that must have required years of experience to master. These objects served no practical purpose that a gold bracelet does not cut what a gold bead does not plant crops. Their purpose was visual, symbolic, social. They communicated status instantly. If copper tools improved survival, gold objects improved reputation. And reputation in early societies could mean everything. At the same time that these elite burials were appearing, population across southeastern Europe was increasing significantly. Archaeological surveys show more settlements appearing across fertile valleys and coastal plains between 5500 to 4500 BC. Larger populations meant more farmers, more craftsmen, more traders, and more demand for tools. Metal production expanded to meet this demand to many settlement sites. Archaeologists have discovered increasing quantities of metallurgical debris, fragments of slag, broken molds, crucibles, and furnace remains. These traces show that copper working was no longer a rare experimental activity. It had become a regular part of daily life in certain communities. The growth of these industries began reshaping settlement organization as well. At sites such as Karanovo in Bulgaria and Harsova in Romania, houses were arranged around open communal spaces where activities like tool production and craft manufacturing took place. Workshops were often located near these central areas, suggesting that metalworking had become socially important, not just economically useful. Metallurgy was no longer hidden knowledge practiced quietly in isolated homes. It was becoming a visible, organized craft. And as populations grew and trade networks expanded, entire regions began specializing in particular techniques. The Balkans became famous for advanced casting technologies, producing durable tools and weapons. Anatolian craftsmen, meanwhile, developed decorative copper objects with intricate surface designs. These regional differences were not barriers. They were opportunities. Communities exchanged their distinctive products through expanding trade routes that connected villages hundreds of kilometers apart. Copper from the Carpathian Mountains traveled south and west. Obsidian from Aegean Islands continued moving northward. Pottery styles spread between cultures. Ideas traveled with the objects that be why now. Southeastern Europe had become a vibrant landscape of interconnected societies, each contributing to a growing web of exchange. But prosperity also carried risks. Metal tools could be repaired, reshaped, and reused in ways stone tools could not. A damaged copper spearhead could be heated and reforged. A broken obsidian blade had to be discarded entirely. This durability made copper attractive not just for farming tools, but also for weapons. As wealth increased and trade routes became more valuable, competition intensified. Communities began defending strategic locations. Fortified settlements appeared in certain areas, with walls and defensive positions designed to protect both people and valuable resources. Archaeologists studying destruction layers at some sites have found evidence of violent conflict. Burned structures, shattered weapons, and hastily abandoned homes. The same metal that improved tools and crafts was beginning to shape warfare. And yet, despite these tensions, something remarkable was happening during this period. Human settlements in parts of southeastern Europe were growing to sizes that had never existed before. Around 4500 to 4000 BC, Entire regions witnessed the emergence of enormous communities that dwarfed earlier villages. These were not cities in the later Mesopotamian sense, but they represented a bold experiment in large-scale human organization. Long before cities, before kings, before empires carved their names into stone, something strange caught the human eye. Across the rough hills and dry valleys of the Anatolian highlands, scattered among the rocks and dusty soil, small greenish stones glimmered under the sun. At first they looked no different from the countless minerals buried in the earth. But hunters, toolmakers, and wandering gatherers began noticing something unusual about them. These stones behaved differently. For thousands of years, humans had mastered the art of shaping stone. Flint could be struck carefully to produce razor-sharp edges. Obsidian could fracture into blades sharper than modern surgical tools. Every hunter, every craftsman, every survivalist understood the language of stone, how it cracked, how it shattered, how it split when struck just right. Stone was predictable, but these strange greenish rocks were not. When struck with a hammerstone, they didn't break. They bent. The first time it happened must have confused the toolmaker completely. Imagine sitting beside a fire, trying to shape a tool like you had done 1,000 times before, raising a stone hammer, striking the mineral, expecting a sharp fracture. Instead, the rock flattened, IT dented, IT changed shape like soft clay, yet it remained solid. What they had discovered without knowing it was native copper, small nuggets of metal, weathered out of underground veins by thousands of years of wind, rain, frost, and shifting earth scattered quietly across the landscape waiting for someone curious enough to experiment with them. And that curiosity would change human history forever. Like tea first, the earliest craftsmen probably treated copper as a strange curiosity. Something different, interesting, but not necessarily revolutionary. But once they began striking it again and again, they noticed something extraordinary. Copper could be shaped, not just once, but repeatedly. Each hammer blow flattened it more. It could be stretched, thin, bent into loops or spirals. Slowly, through trial and error, ancient craftsmen began forming tiny objects, beads, pins, hooks, small ornaments that could decorate clothing or hair. The earliest archaeological evidence of this experimentation appears around 5500 BC at several settlements scattered across Anatolia and the Balkans. At a site called Konu, in what is now southeastern Turkey, archaeologists discovered delicate copper beads and small tools. But the truly remarkable part wasn't the objects themselves, that IT was how they were made. There were no furnaces, YET, and O melting and O casting. Just hammering. Stone tools striking copper nuggets again and again, patiently shaping them through a method we now call cold hammering that IT worked. But only for a while. After repeated hammer blows, the metal would begin to change. It became stiff, brittle, harder to shape. Eventually, it would crack if pushed too FA or .AT first. This must have seemed like a frustrating mystery. Why would the metal suddenly stop cooperating? But ancient craftsmen were excellent observers. They lived in worlds where survival depended on understanding subtle changes in nature. And somewhere, someone noticed something incredible, that if the copper was heated in fire, it softened again. The discovery of annealing, heating metal to restore its softness, was one of the earliest breakthroughs in metallurgy. And it probably happened not in a laboratory, but beside a simple hearth during a long night of experimentation. Imagine a copper ornament accidentally falling into the fire. When it was pulled back out, glowing red, it behaved differently. Suddenly it could be hammered again, shaped again, changed again. That single realization opened a door humanity had never seen before. For the first time in history, humans were not just shaping natural materials, they were transforming them. And this knowledge began spreading quietly between communities. AT this time, villages across Anatolia were already changing rapidly. Agriculture had taken root thousands of years earlier, allowing humans to settle permanently rather than wander endlessly. As hunter-gatherers point, one of the most fascinating of these settlements was a place we now call Catalhoyuk. It was unlike anything the world had seen before. Instead of scattered huts, This settlement was a dense maze of mud brick houses packed tightly together like a honeycomb. There were no streets between them. People moved across rooftops. Ladders descended through openings in the ceilings, leading into homes below. Inside these houses, life was vibrant and complex. Walls were covered with paintings, scenes of animals, hunts, rituals. Plastered bull skulls decorated rooms with their massive horns jutting outward like silent guardians. Beneath the floors, families buried their dead. Generation after generation lived inside these structures, building their lives directly on top of their ancestors. But something else was happening inside certain houses. Something new. Archaeologists studying the remains discovered areas that were clearly workshops, places where specialized tasks were performed. In some homes, obsidian tools were carefully crafted from volcanic glass imported from distant mountains. In others, textiles were woven. And in a few, something unusual appeared. Copper tools, copper fragments, hammerstones worn down by striking metal. This tells us something important. Metallurgy was not evenly shared knowledge. Certain families, certain lineages may have guarded the techniques of copper working. They controlled access to the metal and the skills required to shape it. Knowledge itself was becoming power, and outside these settlements, the world was beginning to change as well. Around 5200 BC, the climate shifted dramatically. Temperatures dropped, growing seasons shortened. Rain patterns changed. Scientists today call this the 5.2 kilo-year climate event, a cooling period that stressed agricultural societies across Europe and Western Asia. For early farming communities, this was dangerous. Shorter growing seasons meant smaller harvests. Smaller harvests meant less food. And less food meant pressure, tension, survival challenges. Suddenly, better tools mattered more than ever. Stronger needles for sewing leather clothing. Sharper knives for processing plant fibers. More durable implements for farming and crafting. Copper began proving its value, that a copper awl could punch holes through thick leather more easily than bone. A copper blade stayed functional longer when cutting tough plant stalks. The advantages were small, but important. And once communities realized this, demand for copper slowly began to grow. But copper was not everywhere. Some villages had it nearby, but many did not. And this created something that would shape human civilization for thousands of years: trade. Communities living near copper deposits suddenly possessed something valuable, something other villages wanted. And so exchange networks began expanding across the landscape. Goods began traveling farther than ever before. Stone tools, ceramics, animal hides, food, and now Metal Point, one of the earliest major copper mining sites discovered by archaeologists, lies in modern-day Bulgaria at a place called Ai Bunar, ABY around 5000 BC. Miners were already digging deep shafts into the earth to reach copper or buried underground. Some of these shafts descended more than 10 meters deep. That might not sound extraordinary today, but imagine the effort required with nothing but stone tools, wooden supports, and human muscle. Mining was dangerous. Tunnels could collapse. Air grew thin underground. Workers needed planning, coordination, and leadership. This was no longer a simple village activity. It was organized labor. Expeditions likely traveled to these mines, extracted ore, and carried it back to settlements where skilled craftsmen transformed the raw material into tools and ornaments. Trade networks stretched wider and wider. And with them, society itself was becoming more complex. In some communities, copper objects became symbols of connection to distant places. Certain regions developed their own distinctive styles, unique shapes of pins, axes, or jewelry that marked where they were made. Just by looking at a copper object, people could tell where it came from. And as the metal spread across the Balkans and Anatolia, something new began appearing in the archaeological record. Not just tools, but wealth.